Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, fans and haters of Board on the Corner, it is that time of year again when I announce the nominees for my favorite award, the 2009 Douchebag of the Year. Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper for, where to begin? Off the top of my head, he abandoned and slandered Canadian citizens of Muslim heritage when they got in trouble abroad. His government blocked the law-abiding Scottish MP from giving a lecture in Canada just because he supported Palestine, while the Harperites totally ignore an extremist group like the Jewish Defense League. His party pulled funding to a gay pride parade and fired the minister who originally gave it a grant just because they weren't comfortable with cross-dressers. He got caught on camera threatening to teach Parliament a lesson if he gets a majority, as well as slagging women and gay rights groups as left-wing fringe groups when he's supported by right-wing fringe groups. And finally, not showing a single shred of financial competence in this recession, despite supposedly being an economist. The many celebrities who more than overstayed their 15 minutes of fame. Here's a list compiled by me and the fans. Kanye West for once again being such a douchebag at an award show that I'm a little tempted to put his face on my award. Megan Fox for being an obnoxious and very stupid diva while having absolutely no talent at all. Miley Cyrus for not only being so thin-skinned that she left Twitter over some idiot calling her fat, but for claiming to have a strict moral Christian upbringing while being one of the most sexualized products of the Disney Channel today. Richard and Mayumi Hing, aka the family of Balloon Boy, for possibly the most insulting, insipid, and just plain dumb publicity stunt of this past year at least. Roman Polanski and his apologist for thinking that there's nothing wrong with drugging a 13-year-old girl, raping her repeatedly, and running from the country to avoid a reduced sentence. Perez Hilton for, with this guy you almost don't need a reason. Amy Winehouse for actually making Keith Richards look good, even when sober. Nadia Solman, aka the Octomom, for single-handedly making a sick joke out of fertility treatments, living on welfare, and single motherhood simultaneously. John and Kate Gosselin for milking every last drop of their questionable family values with book deals, tabloid exposure, and spending so much of their divorce bitching about money instead of who's supposed to be taking care of those 8 kids of theirs. And finally, the Learning Channel, the producers of Toddlers and Tiaras, and pageant families in general for needlessly exploiting kids through these shallow, pointless, and sometimes over-sexualized beauty pageants when some of them aren't even done breastfeeding yet. The Nobel Prize Committee, over its very odd decision to give this year's Peace Prize to U.S. President Barack Obama. Gary Bettman, the NHL, the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Calgary Flames, and Sean Avery just for good measure. Mr. Bettman and the NHL used pretty much every dirty trick in the book to keep BlackBerry billionaire Jim Balsillie from buying the defunct Phoenix Coyotes and moving them to Hamilton where they might actually make money. As for the Maple Leafs, never mind them being the textbook definition of crappy hockey at the best of times, during this slugfest they had the nerve to claim that they can and will personally veto any NHL team that wants to play in Southern Ontario. The Calgary Flames are on here for a very simple reason that we all know by now. Even though there isn't enough H1N1 vaccine to go around, even though they are all healthy men and therefore very unlikely to be affected by this virus, they illegally got the vaccine anyway, and think it's perfectly justified. Yeah, tell that to the family whose grandfather they might have to bury because of your entitlements, guys. And Sean Avery? Well, let's just say that it takes a very upstanding guy to go out of his way to get a bunch of reporters to look at him and then call his ex-girlfriend sloppy seconds. The Obama haters, or as I call them, the devil spawn of Joe McCarthy and possibly the KKK, for not even trying to use facts and good taste to criticize the president. No, they insist on calling him a Muslim, which is badly disguised racism if I've ever seen it, calling him a Nazi, which makes absolutely no sense, screaming socialist at anything that actually tries to help people, and insisting he was born in Kenya despite very easy-to-find evidence that he was born in Hawaii. Incidentally, these same people never ever raise a peep at the fact that John McCain was born in Panama, and therefore is much less likely to be a natural-born U.S. citizen than Obama. By the way, Fox News, for feeding and occasionally starting this vile, dishonest, bigoted, and hateful propaganda without anything even resembling journalism ethics, you can be guaranteed that if you win this award, you're the first people I'll mention in the speech. Oh, and since you claim to be fair and balanced, answer me this. Why do you go so far out of your way to criticize the Obama government, even for things that you inherited from your hero George W. Bush, when just a few years ago you said that criticizing the president at all made you un-American and a traitor? Bell Canada for charging its business customers for long-distance calls made on hacked phone lines. This is not only very sleazy, but I could swear that it's a criminal offense. After all, they're directly making money off of fraud and identity theft. Focus on the Family, the National Organization for Marriage, Cara Prejean, the Republican Party, who are really just a bunch of bigots in suits, for trying their damnedest to stop gay marriage in America at all costs, including revoking it in states that have legalized it, even by the free votes that the Christian right claims to insist on. Not only that, but they repeatedly scream that gay marriage will destroy families, destroy marriage, and destroy society. Guys, many places around the world have had same-sex marriage for years, and the earth is still here. They also have the nerve to say that going out of their way to block homosexuals from having the same rights as everyone else is somehow not being bigoted or discriminatory. And as for Carrie Prejean, who famously lost the Miss USA pageant when she opposed same-sex marriage, and recently made a scene on the Larry King Show by refusing to talk to a gay caller, she's just another example of the typical two-faced fundy as far as I'm concerned. She says in one breath that she respects the choice of gay marriage, then totally opposes it the next, cries religious persecution when people stand up to her, and the entire time that she claims to have had a morally upstanding upbringing, she conveniently forgets to mention that she posed in just her underwear in previous modeling gigs, and then made a sex tape for her boyfriend when she was 17. Various unions for even thinking of striking while we're in the middle of a recession. The most famous examples in Ontario lately have been the York University Teaching Union and the union representing driving testers. Look, in principle I support you guys trying to be treated well and make a decent wage, but bickering over not getting a big enough raise is just plain stupid. The economy is in the crapper right now. Where the hell do you expect that money to come from? Chris freaking Angel? Shauna Holmes, Betsy McCaughey, Sarah Palin, and the private health insurance industry for not only demonizing the idea of lower-class Americans having any kind of health care for free, but resorting to complete lies to do it. Obama's healthcare plan wasn't perfect to start with, and is even less so now after you vultures have had your way with it. But instead of using legitimate points, you decide to make it sound like middle-class Americans would be wiped out in concentration camps, which isn't far off from what's already happening, interestingly enough. You also claim public health care is insanely expensive, when America actually spends far more per patient under the current system than any country with public health care does, and its people usually don't live as long. In the case of Canadian Shauna Holmes, this is particularly interesting because she went on TV coast to coast, claiming to be the survivor of a brain tumor that would have killed her if she'd waited for treatment in Canada. The problem with that story is that it's a total lie. She only had a mild cyst, and one that the American insurance companies would have refused to treat, by the way, because it was a pre-existing condition. Oh, and I'm sliding the mainstream media in with this as well, because they very rarely, if ever, stood up to any of these pundits for their bullshit. Holmes was never personally questioned about her fake story, even by her local newspaper, and Sarah Palin and Betsy McCaughey were never asked to prove any of their accusations by so-called real journalists. It took Jon Stewart, of all people, to illustrate to the public that McCaughey was talking completely out of her ass, and sure enough she lost her lobbying job the next day. The Oxford Community Police in Woodstock, Ontario, for their absolutely absurd level of incompetence in handling the abduction and murder of Tori Stafford. Most people in Ontario already know the drill by now, but for anyone else I'll give you the short version. Tori was taken from her school back in the spring by a woman who no one knew. This was filmed on a surveillance camera as well, but for reasons that no one has ever really explained, the Oxford police refused for the longest time to treat the case as a kidnapping. This is despite the fact that a child being taken by a stranger and both of them going missing is abduction under Canadian law. Exactly how Tori died remains unknown at this time, but I have always maintained that if she wasn't murdered soon after being taken, then she may be alive today if the Oxford cops didn't drag their feet. The World Health Organization and the media at large, again, for creating this totally unnecessary panic over the H1N1 flu virus. First they call it the swine flu for no particular reason, crippling already struggling farmers. Then they make it sound like the worst plague since the Black Death, when all credible research, and actual cases around the world, have shown it to actually be less dangerous than the usual flu virus. And they do this repeatedly. My personal favorite is when the WHO recently gave this advice to anyone who is sick from the virus. No joke, they said to seek medical attention. Really? See a doctor? No shit. I was just going to sit in my living room for a few days until my family has either died or turned into zombies. Finally, the Niagara Crown Attorney's Office, Ontario Premier Dalton McGuinty and party, and Hamilton City Hall for doing fuck all in general. McGuinty's distaste for solid action is already well known to the residents of Caledonia, who've had to suffer through a hostile native land occupation for the last 3 years, while the Ontario Provincial Police refuse to enforce the law, unless you're a white citizen, and McGuinty and Ottawa each dodge any responsibility for the land claim. More recently, he's been dogged by problems in the health ministry under George Smitherman, who has now decided to run for the mayor of Toronto. I guess time will tell as to whether or not his opponents will bring up the many millions of dollars embezzled by the e-health program, or the hundreds of people who died from C. difficile outbreaks, both of which happened under Smitherman's watch, with no action at all taken by McGuinty. His successor, on the other hand, did have to resign to save face. The inaction by McGuinty's government took an even more outrageous turn when the Niagara Crown Attorney's Office inexplicably dropped charges against James Cedar, an admitted peeping Tom, who continues to stalk his next-door neighbors. Yet strangely, the authorities in the same area thought that a protest by senior citizens against their hospital being closed somehow warranted arrests. As for Hamilton City Hall, they repeatedly spent the vast majority of their time bickering and putting their heads in the sand, even when the recession caused one of our two major steelmakers to shut down, a very big deal in this town. More importantly, though, when the lower parts of the city were flooded due to an old and crumbling sewer system, and an emergency meeting was called to try to fix it, Councillor Bob Pertina pulled the plug on as soon as any notion of a city insurance plan was proposed. There you have it, everyone, the official nominees for 2009 Douchebag of the Year Award. Please leave your notes, comments, emails, and video responses to vote. The deadline will be December 18th, and the winner will be announced on New Year's Eve. That's it for me.